Welcome to Another Education is Possible, a podcast about education's radical potential. I'm your host, Jordan Corson. In today's episode, Professor Amanda Tachine takes listeners through her own journey and shares the Navajo story of the Twin Warriors. And we explore some of her work, including her book, Native Presence and Sovereignty in College, and her volume co-edited with Z. Nicolazzo, Weaving and Otherwise. And our conversation explores the tensions, possibilities, and contradictions between access and sovereignty for indigenous college students. And if this is a podcast about the possibility of education being otherwise, education's role in making another world possible, Amanda offers a vision and a method for this otherwise. In addition to just a warm conversation, this is an episode full of gratitude and lots of great reading recs, including one of my favorite educational researchers, Leigh Patel. So let's listen in to Amanda Tachine, Weaving Possibility. Amanda Tachine, welcome to Another Education is Possible.
Thank you for having me here.
Thank you so much
I
for...
appreciate it so much.
I appreciate you being here. It's wonderful to have you on as a guest. So I think let's just start by getting to know you a bit. Could you share who you are, particularly as it relates to what we'll talk about today?
Absolutely. Let me start with the way I've always been taught to introduce myself, which is in my Navajo language. Yat esh e Amanda Tachine Nishya, Nanisht Esha Tachine Nishla, Ezatlana Bashashi, Twaha Dashache Ado, Ashia Dashanale, look aunt here Danasha, Ego Edzana Nishla. And what I shared with you in English, I'll translate. And let me be straight up, like translating Navajo into English, it really flattens like the meaning of to English, the meaning of what I'm translating. There's so much more depth in the way the English really flattens the meanings behind things. I just want to preface that. But what I did share was my name's Amanda Tachine, and I'm come from the Red Streak Running Into the Water clan. That's my maternal side clan. And then I shared my paternal side clan, which was Izaflana, which is mini goats. And then I shared my grandparents' clan, both my mother and my father's side. And so Tromaha is the Water's Edge clan, and Ashihi is the Salt clan. So I like sheep, salt, water. I Those are who I come from and my people. And then I also shared in Navajo the place that I'm from, Lukantia, which means the patch of wide reeds, also referred to as Ganado, Arizona, which is on the reservation of the Navajo Nation. And then the last thing in our introductions we say is ego which means like that's how I identify myself as a Native woman, which is pretty beautiful considering we're in a season, and which I'm grateful for, of indicating our pronouns to folks. And in our teachings, it's always been a part of our process of identifying how we move in the world as a woman, as a being. And it sets kind of like, the way I describe it is, when we say in Navajo, it sets like a protocol on how people will associate around me versus how I hear someone say it, and when they say it, then I know themselves. So it's already been a part of our way of acknowledging who we are. So all of that to say is that I introduce it shares my clans and my lineage and where I come from, which is matrilineal in nature, connected to the land of the patch of wide reeds, and I identify as a woman. All those things threaded are woven into the way I see the world in my research and into my writing and my thinking as my clan relatives land, and knowing I'm recognizing through a woman perspective, a matrilineal perspective. And I'm happy to be here. I'm currently faculty at University of Oregon in Eugene, and I just arrived here with my family about 4 months ago. So we're still finding place here and transitioning, and I'm just delighted to be in conversation with you.
It's an honor. And I love that, this is very meta, but you're weaving. You're already
Mhm.
weaving the notion of weaving, which will be woven into our conversation
Yeah,
today.
that's a good way to describe it.
So I want to, as you and I talked about before we recorded, I don't want to go through the entire terrible, violent, genocidal history. It continues, of course, but in the so-called Americas of what indigenous education has looked like. But maybe start with how your work enters the conversation. And um, you describe indigenous students' educational experiences as very often invisibilized,
Hmm.
particularly within educational research. So could you talk a little bit about how your research challenges that discourse?
Absolutely. And thanks for beginning us off with with this great question. It's very generous in nature. And yeah, you're correct that the history of Indigenous ed is, to be fair, I feel like in a larger public knowledge base is many people don't know about our history and us as a people living right now in this nation state. And I, as a Navajo girl growing up on the Navajo res, I call it Nav res, colloquially we say that, a small town called Ganado, I said earlier. I didn't realize that even in my own bringing in schooling systems, like we didn't really learn about the history of our people in the ways that I think people often assume we would learn, considering I was on Navajo. I definitely heard my language spoken, definitely saw the cultural practice. It was in our livelihood. But when you get into the schooling, I thought it was a really be at the moment though, when you're little and you're going through the school, you're not knowing what you're not being taught. Like I wasn't as critical. I didn't understand. I did though understand why the heck I questioned, like, why do we keep struggling? Like why do we keep like why is my family struggling financially, like in many dimensions, like just the struggle was real. I lived it, family is still living it. And then in schooling we learn what folks are learning around the United States and really, like a democratic society and civic ways of being, and but our history was just not included. And then to recognize that in that not knowing, that invisibility, that's what then was offering, like opening these questions of what's wrong with us. At the end of the day, I was framing these questions of like, why are we always struggling? And then also framing, then what's wrong. If you grew up like where I grew up on, it's a very rural community. Like to go grocery shopping is like an hour away. We just talked about movie theaters just right before this, and because now I love movies, so even going to the movie theater was a luxury, and it was an hour away drive, and there wasn't a theater in our town, and so we had one post office, two gas stations, but one closed down. We were real sad about that. And then one. So it kind of shares with you, kind of like just to do things was such a chore. It was financially a chore to do things. And now, given that, I'm be honest though, we had a beautiful land. Like I grew up running around on the mesas and being with family. All of that was occurs happening. But I was already as a teenager feeling like, what's wrong? Like, what's going on? Why are we struggling? Why is our community struggling? And then it wasn't until I started going to college and I took American Indian Studies courses and started really learning about colonization, even have a language of colonization or decolonization, or really learning the language. At the time, we'd even have settler colonialism when I was an undergrad. But it was these framings later on that I started reading, and then I started peeling out the layers of my own experience of like, wow, no wonder our community we're struggling at home. It's because policies have created the conditions for us to continue to struggle, and it's still really struggling. And so in education, then when you anytime someone picks up looking at research on education, whether it's their national standards or state standards, native folks are often we are the least likely to whatever, all the dimensions. And so I was raised and also and in a community that I didn't see that within ourselves. I didn't see like we were low in reading. You don't know, we're cool. But then when you get into grad school and you're like seeing all these like ways we're framed, and I was like, wow, you don't even people are not even aware of like how our lives are and so forth. So all that to say is that what really was what drew me to write this book was it was honestly it was a gift. I was writing it like a love. I say it as like it's a love letter to young Native people who are often also recognizing that they're still 2026 not learning about things in grad school. Some classes have it. Undergrad, some do, but in high school, largely many aren't learning in depthly about indigenous boarding school issues, colonization issues, land theft issues. They're not learning about those things. And so the book was a kind of like, this is for you to understand the monsters. I frame them as monsters are centuries old, and they're making it difficult for our people. It's not us. We're not the problem. There is a problem here. And so that was what the impetus is for me to write. That was also for my younger self, for me, because I was working through unraveling my own journey of grappling with my sense of belonging and sense of place to a community that I love and saw as strengths, rather than seeing how we're just invisibly and unacknowledged in the discourse, and why these stories are so relevant for us today. So yeah, so that's a long story of personal in nature, and then really then seeing the research as I started learning more about that and trying to weave that into the story worlds of the ten students in the book.
And so then there's kind of this common sense idea of the therefore is increase access. And that's a big focus in your work, but you're careful to neither accept access as a stated fact that all we need to do is improve access, nor are you, I'm probably going to cut this because I don't want to, center my work here, but as somebody who constantly says we need to probably just burn these institutions to the ground because they're fundamentally colonial in nature.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so you really balance this idea and explore this, but I'd love to hear a bit more about how you engage that tension of access, but access to colonial institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that's those contradict it's a contradiction. Like sometimes I think I'm grappling with contradiction ways of moving in the world, especially in education. Because in one hand, I can see if a native young person is talking to me about going to college and is hesitant on whether to go or not, then I'm honestly about them about, yeah, if you were to go to a university, for example, then it's going to be definitely white streamed and colonial in nature, which may make you devalue and make you second guess yourself as a Native person. It may do that. Everybody has their own journey. While at the same time, though, I also recognize when we how there's such a need for our Native folks, Native people in all areas of life that definitely need a credential. We need a Native person who understands, who's an economist, someone who does taxes, that understands tribal policies. Like I'm looking for that myself right now. Someone who can help me, who's Native, who does that. We need Native journalists who write Native stories from a Native angle. We need Native films because there's not many. So everything in life, I need a Native. I would love a Native doctor. I never had a medical doctor who is Native that could understand the philosophies that I come from. I needed a Native pediatrician when I had little ones. So, like in every life experience that I've encountered, that we often encounter when we're seeking resources, tools, support in many ways, there's a credential to that. There's a knowledge base of learning that is needed for that particular expertise to do that work. And we need Native people in those places. So then at the same time, I do acknowledge that I contradicting. In one hand, I'm recognizing that to some institutions are so seeped in colonialism, and then at the other hand, the need and the value of needing expertise in a particular field for our own self-determination and sovereignty. I mean, really, if we were to think about the ways that my people, the Navajo people, started valuing the need for higher ed as a degree, was because non-natives were encroaching on the land of Navajo people and starting to extract minerals that were precious to Navajo people. But our community, my elders didn't understand the language that these large companies were coming and bringing their own lawyers, doing all of these very unlawful ways that to this day that we are now still dealing with are wrapped up in legalese because of it. And so our leaders at the time were like, we need our own Navajo lawyers. to have the language and to know that this is not right. We need our own Navajo people to do this. And so, in all other areas. And so I recognize the fight that our elders face in going to Washington, D.C. This is what I learned in my research to advocate for presence at these institutions. And so then that's what makes me think about, gosh, and this was like in the 1960s, 70s. It wasn't recent. It was recent. I'm sorry, I was recent and just like 50 years ago. And so there's a part of me then is like, gosh, we need that. So but it's real though. The tension is real. And I've talked, I think talking with others about this has really been important for me because there's some times where I'm so frustrated with institutions, and so I really lean on like Sandy Grande's work of not being of, but being in, like being able to do that. And so I definitely feel like I traverse that in my own world. I really appreciate also La Paperson's Third University of As Possible's work of like we are all skyborgs in many ways. And I see myself as like a little spider in the machine, the institutional machine, tweaking up a screw that I may not see in my lifetime, but I'm working towards the lifetime of my children and my children's children. And so there's things like that that I think our scholarly kin prior and past who have traversed all of these worlds has helped me to think about that. But then I also have respect for folks who are in one end don't believe in the institutions at all. And those who are like fully on board all institutions. I think there's everyone comes to it in a different way. And so I know that I feel like I'm straddling, but centering to me is really around indigenous peoples and the fight for our self-determination and sovereignty. And so when I see that, then I see like how can like 4 years as an undergrad or 5 or 6 give you what degree can help you to help fight towards self-determination and sovereignty. And so I learned that a lot from Brian Brayboy, who's written and speaks along those lines as well. But so this book is really, to be honest, I mean, I think I feel like when I was writing it, I was feeling the tension. There were some days where I just want to just throw my dukes up and be like, this is it. I'm at these places. And then at the same time, then there's days, the next days I know we need folks in journalism. Like I feel like that was one huge one that I'm learning is like native journalists to write the issues that are happening all the time. There's many that are growing, but we're still invisible even in the public media and in news cycles. And so yeah, so I in the book would help me to think through that and acknowledge that I'm a walking contradiction in many ways. I say one thing and then the next thing I move in a different way. And I think that's what it's like living in this nation state, fighting for freedom and self-determination.
Contradiction is such a powerful way of framing it, and not to resolve them, but to live within contradiction. And so many
Mm-hmm.
amazing references throughout
Mm-hmm.
there. And yeah, to add, of course, Brian Brayboy is deeply relevant. But I was
Yeah.
also thinking of the Night Watchman, which deals with a lot of what you were talking about in the 60s,
Yeah.
70s, where you really get into the minutia of
Mm.
how he was trying to navigate and figure out how to speak to Washington. And yet at the same time, there's this great, one of my favorite lines of any book of the trick was how to remain a problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not
Mm-hmm.
to allow whiteness and colonialism to solve the issue, but to keep it being an issue throughout.
Mm-hmm.
And before I ask my next question, I wonder if we could just tease out a little bit more. You're hinting at these things which are so central to your to one of your books. Can you talk a little bit about maybe the Navajo Twin Warriors and what that is before we get into?
Yeah, thanks so much. And this is a good time. Actually, I'm glad we're doing the recording now. We had planned to record it earlier in the season, but this is winter time, and for us as Navajos, we really can't share our creation stories until the winter season. And so this is our. If you had asked me in a different season, I wouldn't be able to be as in depth. I'd just paraphrase, summarize. So the winter season in our tradition is a time of story sharing, and it's after the first snow in our homelands. And so I would just confirm it snowed actually in our homelands last week. And so this is a good time for story sharing. But in our story, there's we've always faced monsters in this current world, and we live in what we frame as the glittering world. Some say it's our fourth world, some say it's our fifth world, which is pretty beautiful and is why I'm such a Marvel head too, because Marvel world multiverse, we're watching with my family and we're like, that's Navajo philosophy. We're definitely living in the glittering world, a multiverse world. And so in this world, there were monsters that were killing our people and and creating havoc within the community. And Changing Woman, who's one of our holy beings, she had twins, and these twins were so special that they matured really quickly. Like there's no time. Time is a colonial construct that we were been told that they grew up really quickly into teenager age in a matter of months, and they developed, and they were just so skilled in what they were doing and how they were growing up as warriors. And so during the time of the monsters, these twin warriors then wanted to help the people and wanted to save our people for the futures, but they wanted to ask their father was the son, for weapons to help them defeat the monsters. And so they actually went through a series of tests, which is pretty beautiful too, like these tests to demonstrate their strength and the resolve that their father was looking at and seeing. And they passed all of these series of tests, that test for intelligence and courage and bravery and all of these ways of seeing them as warriors. And then once they reached their son, I mean the son, father's son, after going through these, they asked for weapons, and they were gifted these weapons. And these weapons are like rainbow as a transporter process, and songs and prayers and the wind, like the elements were all part of like these tools that help them to go back and defeat these monsters. And so yeah, so Spider Woman was one of those holy beings that taught them gave songs and prayers for them. And so they traveled back and they ended up defeating monsters, and they're so revered in our community because of their bravery. We say we're alive today, and because they defeated these monsters. So this is a story that I've heard a lot when I was a little girl growing up. Everyone, and whether wintertime, sometimes we would hear it at school, sometimes you hear it at community events. It was just taught to us in various ways and junctures. And then when I was starting my dissertation, so my book was my dissertation, I was kind of think of it as like, what are the journeys, story experiences of Native college students, is how generally I was thinking around it. But the first interview I had was with Cecilia, who we opened the book with. And she brought the Twin Warrior story into our interview, which I thought was so beautiful. And she brought it up because she remembered that in high school, she was doing a presentation and at a community event, and where there were Native elders in there. And her classmate were presenting on a particular topic. And then at the end of their presentation, one of the elders stood up and he made a comment, and he remarked that they did such a wonderful job. And he said that you two are like the twin warriors, and you're going to college to helpfully get what you need to combat and help our people. And so Cecilia shared that story, which then she conceptualized, like, she's like, I think all of us Native students are actually warriors. And they're all, because there's monsters that are still living now. So then that's another reason why that contradiction of like they're recognizing the monsters are these colonial structures, and how then we're going to these institutions as part of learning the tools, getting the weaponry to defeat these monsters. And so that's what the story then is written about. So then I was wanting to write about, so what are the monsters now? Like, what is tormenting our young people in college? But also then what are the weapons that are using to navigate through? Yeah, so the Twin Warriors was really a beautiful way of not centering Diné ways into the book, like to assert that this is viable, rigorous stories, because stories have been so devalued. Indigenous people have been so devalued as knowledgeable people. And so I'm like wanting to at one time assert the value within that story of the twin warriors and threading it through was really important for me. And I just really thank Cecilia for bringing that into our very first interview, which then helped frame the larger book and the monsters and then the weapons.
Yeah, it's amazing. I recommend it to everyone if any
Yeah.
listeners who have a chance to read the book. And I think you've already touched on some of the examples of weapons in your earlier responses, and I think it's really powerful to think about these students and their experiences. And this is a bit meta and maybe self-involved since we're education researchers, but I
Mm-hmm.
do wonder about the potential. You know, when I was reading your book, I was thinking a lot about Lee Patel's work. And I
Mm-hmm.
think she wrote, did you write the foreword to your book?
She wrote the forward to the weaving and otherwise,
Yeah,
yeah, she's
okay,
such
yes,
a
yes, yes.
lovely, lovely
Yeah.
person.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I was thinking about the possibility of maybe this connection that these weapons might also challenge the dominance of settler colonialism in educational research itself.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure if this comes up. Of course, it comes up in your work through thinking with and listening to your interlocutors, the people with whom you worked, but I'm wondering if you think about yourself as using these weapons as well in as a way to challenge how educational research dominantly operates.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And thank you for ushering Lee Patel's work, her framing questions, right, and decolonizing ed researcher, and her book that's been so seminal to me and the students that I'm lucky to learn alongside is, why now, why me, and who, like, pretty much thinking about these questions about why us and who does it benefit? Like, who does the research benefit? And I think already those questions challenge settler colonial ways of just kind of this profit, this neoliberal ways institutions are framing us as researchers to benefit ourselves individually, whether it's through tenure or publications, or the institutions in terms of their rigor and their merit. But the why me, why now, and who does this benefit really challenges those questions, because then you're asking yourselves, like, how is this benefiting the community that we're alongside? So then it moves into a relational, it can move us if it should move us to a relational way of framing it, more so than an individualized framing that settler colonialism is really good about, whereas property and individual ownership really is sentimental to settler colonialism frames. So I feel like that's something that I really try to keep forefront is relational practices and relational movement in the work that we're doing. And so it was definitely in the book, and thinking of relationality of kinship, because all the young people were getting their degrees for their community, whether it was their grandmother, whether it was their niece, their little, there was, or the land, protection of the land. They were already from the jump thinking of relationality as a form of reference, as their like beacon. And so that for me, then I try my best, and I'm hitting the mark, and many times is like, how do I maintain relationality in my thinking? Like, it goes even to the minutia of like publications. Publications of like, I try not to put so much emphasis on prestige in a publication, or because I try to think about like the accessibility. We talk about accessibility in a different framing now, accessibility of whose knowledge is allowable to read, that it's not taken up by these paywalls that institutions are and journals in many ways are also offering. And so like, how then do I have to like be strategic, and like, how do I publish something that I know is needed? There's one hand that I know it's needed in these prestigious places, but at the same time, where can I then write where my community is having open access to that as well? So then writing in the Navajo Times, learning how to write. So like, I had to teach myself how to write and journalists. And even though I was not schooled in that way, but pushing myself to learn that, or be around community who can help me to learn that. but also ushering in students to learn that process with me so then they can learn and do it hopefully later, and but also helps their publication. So like, and that an example of just a publication is the way I try to embody and move in a relational way, which I hope that is then deconstructing, challenging settler colonial practices of individualism and ownership over even knowledge as property. You know, land as property is what settler colonialism, which I think in many ways in the academia it can move towards knowledge as property, which I get a little bristly about when we say whose knowledge is who own. How can an institution own knowledge? You know, it's just, I mean, I can see communities and so forth, but having institutions hold it is it's something I grapple with a lot as well.
Yeah, maybe storing knowledge or carrying with knowledge, but yeah, this idea of codifying and then literally having a legal ownership too. It's
Yeah.
baffling, and yet
Hmm.
persistent. I think that also gets back to the idea of what you were saying before about contradictions. We in our field have to publish, and as professors, we have to teach our students about these norms in some sense. But I think also you challenge just literally if you look at the table of contents of your book, it not only challenges accessibility, just the very structure of it, beginning with storying and creating of scholarly work and thinking with participants as scholars, something that might not fit the moves of a traditional scholarly production and yet has every bit of intellectual rigor, academic research, all of that is still present. um, which I think
Oh,
might
thank
be
you
a
for acknowledging that. Yeah, I didn't
oh,
even think
well,
about it
thank
in
you for
that
making
way.
it.
But yeah, yeah.
This is really disrupting how most of these books look, right? Especially how the dissertation looks, right? Which I think leads to my last real question. We mostly focused on your other lines of scholarship, but you have this beautiful
Hmm.
book, Weaving and Otherwise, um, which offers so much methodologically, philosophically, and you're writing about research and along with an amazing co-editor and many contributors. But and as we mentioned, Lee Patel wrote the foreword for it.
Hmm.
But while you're writing more about research and methodology, I'm wondering about this concept of weaving and how that might take shape educationally or pedagogically.
Yeah, thank you for, I love weaving. Thank you for bringing weaving into this conversation. And first, I just want to note that I was so lucky and grateful to work alongside Z Nicolazzo on Weaving and Otherwise during when COVID, when we were all in confinement in COVID. And I know we're still in COVID. Z was such a beautiful person, and I'm just so grateful for all the contributors and also the publishers. And I also just want to make also a note when I was hearing you talk about like the Teacher College Press with Native presence. I just want to say, like, I think presses that allow for writers to write that acknowledges their ways of knowing that's maybe not prescribed to a particular template, educational template is so important because teachers call it, there were other presses that were interested in native presence, but they wanted me to write very Western in a particular way. And I was just really staunch on like, no, I want to write it in a way with a Navajo voice. I always get moved by Toni Morrison's work on really challenging us not to write to the white gaze, right? And so I was really like wanting to do that. And I was so grateful Teachers College Press because Django Paris runs that series of cultural sustaining pedagogies, which is another fabulous read. So, and I was so grateful to Dr. Paris to say, like, yes, write it the way you want, write it the way in the now, the Navajo voice. And so I just wanted to give, I think, so then when we have places like that, like people like that in places and presses that allow us to do that, the possibilities are just really endless and abundant. And so I just want to thank those folks. So for me, like when the weaving actually really did start with dissertation, because I started weaving as a practice by my mother-in-law. So much love to Elta, my mother. She's a beautiful weaver. And she started teaching me how to weave, and she gifted me, her, my father-in-law gifted me a loom. And then she started teaching me how, and I was weaving as well as I was dissertating. And I remember when I first submitted my first draft, like to my advisor, who I love, Jenny Lee. She's non-native, she's a Korean American. She wrote me back and she's like, "This is good, but dot 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 dot." And I remember just feeling like, oh. And she says, "I think you could do better. I think you can dive deeper," is what she said. And she said, "You can keep going with this if you want. I'll graduate with you with this, but I think you can dive deeper." And I remember thinking, like, thought I dove in deep enough. Like, how the heck do I dive any more deeper? All that to say is that it really made me. I started making connections between my weaving practice and research, and then I started, because what I was trying to do is in the qualitative aspect, the methodological aspect, is like what's hard for me is to like just like to sever quotes from the larger context, because you're kind of we're trained to like put them into themes and then write a little bit of the themes in it and like not repeat themes, not repeat quotes. I mean, and I was feeling like, but this quote, there's I need to like it's like a larger story world and there's connections to the reason, and we're invisible in education or researcher, and that if I just put this quote, someone's going to take it up and misinterpret it. There's so much more. So I was trying to like grapple with like, how do I like allow for stories to come out in ways that honors the history, that honors the future making that their quote arise, that provides story worlds of quotes from archival material. Like, how do I do all of this? And then my own personal story is also woven, and like there's multiple story worlds coming in to this work, but how do I do that? And I was grappling, reading all kinds of qualitative books. I remember trying to figure out the book and I couldn't find the book. So then I just trusted my dissertation advisor, thankful that Dr. Lee said, "Do what you think you need to do." So then I started developing at the time what's called story rug. So where I started weaving what I just shared with you, all of these multiple stories in a pattern form, because weaving is a pattern form. There's repetition that evolves, and I started making those connections. And then I sent her a draft with a story rug, which was just in development stage, and she immediately emailed me back saying, "Whatever you're on, keep going. This is it." So I just went through it. That's why the dissertation looks like you said, like the table of contents is different, because I just kind of went in with like a story rope framework, like a weaving framework. And then with the weaving and otherwise, I wanted to continue to extend that thinking, the analytical thinking, and what do we mean by weaving and otherwise, and talking it up with Z, who is also thinking along the line of qualitative and other researchers that's beyond Western ways. We both were just grappling with like, how can there's folks doing this all the time in all kinds of fields that are just trying to find their analytical home and try to really push beyond what we are often assigned in methods courses. And so we're so grateful for all of the author contributors who are pushing us to think about ways of qualitative research that is often not taught in our classes when we're grad students, which is beautiful because then it allows for us to recognize that we can be creative in our research. We can be creative, and that we come from communities that have ways of knowing that's been passed down that are legitimate and rigorous that we can use. And then how do we use those and then document it? Because then we don't have to cite the same people all the time. Like, and then people start reading it and then they're inspired, like, "Oh, I didn't know you could actually develop methods." I think we get into this thing where we think we can't, we just do whatever someone's giving us and go for it. But I think all of us in that book, weaving and otherwise, are trying to be like, while we're doing the research, we're developing our methodological processes and then writing that out as a gift to offer so folks can also engage in it and also develop more. We need more tools. It's basically tools to help us think through phenomenons. And so weaving has been a useful tool for me, and I continue to use it, and I continue to think of it as a form of analytical story world making that bridges, like I said, all of these multiple worlds into a repetitive pattern.
Which I think hints at the title of the book, which is so central
Mhm.
to hopefully the theme of this podcast, which is that vision of an otherwise. as you said, the other worlds that
Hmm.
become possible. Great. So I think we got
So
it. You,
delighted for you and
yeah.
your work.
I
Oh, I was
I'm
going to
so
share, like, I'm
yeah
just so grateful for
yeah
you and what you're stewarding with this podcast and with your students. And yeah, like we're just doing what we can each and every day. And so thank you for, I love this conversation and thank you for
yeah.
inviting me to be alongside all the folks that I bring into these conversations.
Yeah, I mean, it is the real honor is to be to be in conversation with you on, and I'm sorry you didn't get to meet the students because they are really, truly the best part of the thing. Today's episode was produced by all of us in the Education, Genocide, Liberation class. If you like our podcast, please like, rate, subscribe, give us 5 stars, follow us, comment, all of that stuff. You can also find us on Instagram and LinkedIn, where another ed is possible. Thanks as always for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode of Another Education is Possible.